One Motzei Shabbat, Mrs. Cohen stood on the doorstep to wish her daughter Chaya a good trip as she got ready to travel with her friends to a wedding in another city. They were going to travel by car and they planned to take turns driving. Mrs. Cohen was not completely calm. She tried not to think about the miles on a dark motorway and the freezing temperatures. After all, they were mature and responsible drivers and they were going to enjoy each other's company. Well, Mrs. Cohen kissed her daughter once again and watched her as she got in the car and drove off. The house still needed cleaning after Shabbat, but Mrs. Cohen knew she had a mission to attend to before beginning with her household tasks. That afternoon, during her Shabbat afternoon nap, she had had a frightening dream that required her to act immediately. In the dream, her mother, who had recently died, appeared in front of her, dressed in a pristine white dress, and smiled at her. Mrs. Cohen was happy when she saw her mother, and they started talking. Well, suddenly her mother's face took on an expression of terrible pain. She began to sob from the depths of her being. Mrs. Cohen asked her what was wrong. Her mother kept on crying and begged her to call Mrs. Stein. Mrs. Cohen answered that she would do so and begged her to stop crying. Her mother could not stop and asked her to promise to call Mrs. Stein. Mrs. Cohen promised her mother, and she started to smile again, and then disappeared from the dream. The time had come to fulfill her promise. Mrs. Stein was a former friend with whom she had been involved in a long-standing family dispute. The truth is that she no longer felt any animosity towards Mrs. Stein. Time has made her realize that the dispute had started from something unimportant. Nevertheless, they had not spoken to each other for so long that dialing the Stein number seemed impossible to her. What would she tell her? What would happen if Mrs. Stein did not want to talk to her? She would be really humiliated. But she had no choice. She could still hear her mother's sobs and the implorations echoing in her ears. She recited a chapter of Tehillim to give her merits so that everything would go well. She took the phone and dialed the number. Shavua Tov, it's Leah Cohen. Mrs. Stein was pleasantly surprised. Leah, I'm so happy to hear your voice. Mrs. Stein also confessed to her that she thought the argument had lasted for too long, but she had not phoned because she felt uncomfortable talking or taking the first step. Each one of them asked for forgiveness for the pain and insult inflicted on both families. After having forgiven each other, they chatted pleasantly and made up for lost time by discussing all the joyous news that they had missed out on. The call ended with a mutual exchange of brachot, wishes for good health and happiness. When Mrs. Cohen hung up, her heart felt lighter. She felt a sense of well-being at having made peace with her former friend, and she then whispered in a low voice, "Thank you, Mom. You always know what to do." She looked up at the clock and she saw that it was already 8:28 p.m. It was time to put the house back in place. Mrs. Cohen ran around the house quickly, doing one task after another. The dishes, sweeping the living room, changing the tablecloth, putting away the leftovers. Suddenly, she was interrupted by the ringing of the phone. She looked at the notification of the caller and her chest tightened. A hospital. A phone call parents dread. "Are you Mrs. Cohen?" a man's voice asked her. Yes, who is this?" Her heart beat so hard and her hands trembled as she tried to hold her phone firmly in her hand. "I'm a police officer," the man replied. "I'm calling to tell you that your daughter Chaya was involved in a terrible car accident tonight. The car is completely destroyed, but your daughter is okay." Mrs. Cohen asked to speak to her daughter. She wanted to hear with her own ears that Chaya was not hurt. After speaking to her daughter, Mrs. Cohen was ready to hear how the accident happened. The policeman explained that the car hit a patch of ice. It deviated from the highway to a section of the road without a railing. The car started falling down on a slope for a few meters before being stopped by a metal railing. This railing prevented the car from descending even further. The police officer himself was completely stunned as he recounted the events of the accident. And he told Mrs. Cohen that her daughter has benefited from a real miracle. Well, Mrs. Cohen's head was spinning as she tried to comprehend the divine revelation she had just witnessed. Hashem had shown her His hand so beautifully by bending down to stop the car that was tumbling down with her beloved daughter and her dear friends, all with their whole lives ahead of them. Just one piece was still missing from the puzzle. Mr. Officer, do you know by any chance what time the accident took place? The exact time was 8:28 p.m. Overwhelmed with emotion, Mrs. Cohen sat down on the kitchen chair. Just when she had hung up with Mrs. Stein, Hashem had saved her daughter's life. That was it. That was the meaning of the dream. Her mother was aware of the decree hovering over her head, and that was what caused her to break down in tears. She could not reveal the details, but had been able to direct her daughter to the source of her salvation. It was the merit of peace. Simply, peace between two Jewish families. Peace made by a person humble enough to reach out and another humble enough to accept it.